What if the medial borders of the scaps were not flush with the rib cage? Could then a reach at 90 degrees be useful for posterior expansion, rib cage retraction, and getting those medial borders to find their nice, cozy home along the ribs? I'm liking where Jason is going, but what Jason is describing is really tough. So Jason is correct. If I can get the medial border of the scapula away from the thorax, aka scapular internal rotation, well then folks, if I can do that, I can get expansion posteriorly. But when you reach at 90 degrees and you see the medial border flaring off of the rib cage, chances are you're probably not getting legitimate scapular internal rotation. But what oftentimes is happening is the rib cage is throwing itself forward, which is what creates that space. A lot of times if you're doing like a manual technique and you can easily get underneath someone's scapula, the thorax has moved so far forward that you're not really getting the expansion posteriorly that you oh so desire. If you can get a situation like that, in order to see if you're actually getting what you want, you have to check the lower rib cage. Because a lot of times when you see the scap flopping way far off of the thorax, chances are the lower rib cage is also way anterior, aka a rib flare, aka you can't stack, aka you can't talk to Zach. And who doesn't want to do that? I'm sure there's a lot of you, but you know, let's go with it, folks. Ideally, you want to see at that 90-degree reach, one, based on the thorax position, and two, based on what's going on with the flexion arc, you ideally want to see the scapula flush against the rib cage. And the reason why I say that is because when you're reaching at 90 degrees of shoulder flexion, you're going to have scapular upward rotation and external rotation, and it's going to be out to the side. But folks, what if I told you that you could still get posterior expansion in that particular situation? You can. Because, well, if you think about it, right, at 90 degrees of flexion, if I got the scapula upwardly rotating and externally rotating up against the rib cage, I'm not going to be able to get much air back there. So, wait, Zach, you're saying there's a way you can still bias some posterior expansion at that position? How do I do that? Well, I'm glad you asked. The key would be, you guessed it, this is kind of the theme of this particular debrief. I need to create relative motion somewhere to where I can drive some scapular internal rotation without having the scap just falling away from the thorax, or in actuality, the thorax falling forward from the scap. And the key to doing that, you beautiful, sexy, outstanding people, is through the humerus. No joke. If I create humeral external rotation and I don't have the scapula move along with that motion, external rotation of the humerus is also internal rotation of the scapula, which is, if I have internal rotation of the scapula, I have an eccentric orientation of muscles on the posterior aspect of the thorax, which means you can get air into the upper back. And the muscles that will pull the scaps into internal rotation are going to be your posterior cuff muscles. Because think about this, folks. We think of the cuff as an external rotator of the humerus, which is going to allow that to tip backwards. If I fix the humerus and I contract the rotator cuff muscles and it pulls the proximal attachments towards the distal, you're going to have scapular internal rotation, which will allow for more air into the upper back. So if you can create that motion anywhere, anytime, you're going to get posterior expansion. So how do I do that? This, folks, is why activities like arm bars with screwdrivers are immensely useful. When you're performing an arm bar at 90 degrees, want to tell that reach please. If I turn my arm and I don't move my scapula or arch my back or anything like that, on that inhale, when I turn my arm in that position, that's creating a relative scapular internal rotation, which is promoting posterior expansion in the posterior thorax. That is so cool. So instead of allowing your scapula to just fall way away from your rib cage, just drive relative humeral motion with the scapula flush, because you're going to get what you're looking for, which is the scapula is going to internally rotate, you're going to get air into the upper back, and life will be good. So that is preferred over letting the scaps not be flush against the rib cage, and the reason why that is because if the scaps are not flush against the rib cage at that particular reach, then chances are you're probably not going to get posterior expansion, because scaps aren't flush, the thorax is likely way in front of the scapula, which is indicative of a loss of relative motion.